Okay, so let's get into the detail. Let's talk about ERCOT. Let's talk about because that's the best example, right, of transition into more renewables. And actually, Texas has done very well in transition into solar. And
and if you want to know why, it's because of government action.
It is, but I also think Texas is uniquely in a unique position that has an independent grid. It also has that variation between it can have very hot times, so it's good for solar, but it also has a lot of wind.
Yeah, so we have excellent renewable resources. But had Rick Perry, who was the governor before Greg Abbott, he built these transmission lines from West Texas to East Texas to the big cities. Had he not built those, there wouldn't be the renewable boom. And in fact, no private actor is going to do that because of the immense costs. Only the government can do that because the government can essentially do that, and then they can recover the cost on the electricity bills.
Okay.
And so that's a clear case of government action saving people money because wind and solar are cheap, and that saves, especially with the price of gas, natural gas these days. Every day, Texans save money because of wind and solar power.
So what percent of the grid is currently renewable within the Texas grid?
So in Texas, wind plus solar on an annual average are probably about 28%.
Okay, and the goal is close to 100%?
Well, I don't know if there's any official goal. The state doesn't have.
But you would ideally want to see that, wouldn't you?
Well, okay, so...
And is that possible, or do you need to have backups?
All right, so that's a great question. I really wanted to talk about this. So let's talk about how a grid works, okay? So because this is the thing I always get, and it just makes me so irritated that nobody will sort of do the research, because there's been a lot of research been done in the last 20 years on how you create a grid that runs mostly on wind and solar that's still reliable and inexpensive.
We did have, was it Sean Connell who was covered? So I know a little bit about this, but do it again.
Yeah, I'll do it again because I think it's useful to repeat this. So let's imagine you have a grid and it's 100% coal. I'm just making this up. And some of the coal is base load, so it runs all the time. And then some of the coal is load following. So during hot days, you turn it up. And you turn it up in the afternoon when people are consuming more, and then it goes down at night. So these are plants you're ramping. Now, let's add 10% of wind to the grid. So what does that do? Well, when the wind blows, when the wind blowing, the wind power is cheaper. And so you turn down the coal because you don't need to burn coal anymore. You're saving money. And when the wind doesn't blow, you turn up the coal. And that what counterbalances the intermittency. And so the important thing here is by adding wind, you save the consumers money because the wind energy is cheaper. And you do reduce the profits of the coal plant, but society is better off. Mm-hmm. And you don't, and one of the big myths are you have to pay for reliability. You don't pay for reliability. The grid already has load following built into it. So when the wind blows, the load following plants just shut down. And when the wind doesn't blow, the load following plants crank up. So this is 10% of the power. So now let's go to 20% of the power. Same thing happens. Mm-hmm. You save money. The load following does it. You go to 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%. Same thing happens. You're just saving money. And you're also adding solar in addition to wind because wind and solar tend to be anti-correlated. They generate power at different times a day. And so by adding them, you have something which is more constant, but still intermittent. You still need the load following power of the coal, of the fossil fuel plants. So then you get to about 70%. And now things change.
Okay.
At this point, adding more wind doesn't do any, or more renewables actually doesn't give you any more value. You can't retire any more coal at that point because you need the coal to counterbalance the intermittency. And so now,
and if you have no coal and there's no,
if it's 100%, if it's 100%, it wouldn't work. And everybody understands that. Yeah. Nobody says let's run a grid with 100% wind and solar with no sort of backs. I mean, it is theoretically possible, but you would have to overbuild so much extra power that it would be cost prohibitive. So the cheapest grid is one that's 70% wind and solar, and then 30% some kind of dispatchable power. Now, you don't want it to be coal. Okay. It could be nuclear, it could be geothermal, it could be natural gas with carbon capture. I mean, there are other options.
Something consistent and reliable.
Yeah, exactly. Something consistent that you can use to counterbalance. Mm-hmm. But you can easily produce, and this is the thing I want your listeners to understand, you can easily produce a 100% reliable grid that's mainly wind and solar, but you have to have some dispatchable power. There's dispatchable power, even nuclear, which is very expensive. It makes sense if it's only generating, say, 15% of your power.
Right.
That even at $6,000 a kilowatt, which is about how much nuclear costs now, it still makes sense to install it for 10% of your power because you can dispatch. People think you can't dispatch nuclear. France does it all the time. You can ramp nuclear up and down. We just don't do it.
$6,000 per
kilowatt to install. That's to build a plant.
Okay. I'm trying to understand that as a comparable to any other. I need a benchmark.
So wind and solar are about 1,400.
Okay, so it's about 4 times more expensive
than wind and solar, right?
But it's cleaner in terms of,
and it's dispatchable. I mean, one of the things that the renewable derangement syndrome people have correct is you cannot compare wind and solar to nuclear directly. You have to think about the grid as a system. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a system, and you want to ask the question: what mix of energies do I want to put in there that gives me cheap, reliable power? And so you're not comparing solar and nuclear because they play different roles on the grid. You want to run as much solar and as much wind as possible because the marginal cost is zero. And as far as nuclear goes, that's what steps in when the intermittency kicks in. And so people have done all of these calculations. And, this is really well tried. So I say I'm extremely irritated when on Twitter, people go, dude, sun doesn't shine at night. What are you going to do? Blackouts, renewable energy is going to make an unreliable grid. I mean, it's like, read the literature. I mean, I'm sure in Bitcoin, you run into people that will just tell you something that it's like, we've worked this out. We know this is not true. And so I'm sure you feel my frustration on that point.
Well, I mean, and this is one of the great things and big arguments for Bitcoin mining being part of a grid is that you can actually overbuild the supply. You can overbuild the supply of wind and solar.
Okay, so let me explain that to your listeners. So if you have a grid that's 70% on average wind and solar, some days it's 120%.
Yeah.
Because when the conditions are great, when it's really windy and really sunny, you're going to be way overproducing. And in that case, you have to do what we call curtail the power, which means it's just wasted.
Yeah.
You just shut them down. But if you have somebody who can take it, that's right.
So we have this is the big thing we've been trying to, or people within our industry have been trying to get across to those who are critical of Bitcoin industry, is saying, no, we can actually support your goals. Bitcoin miners will happily set up within any grid, and they will say, we will take all of your excess energy. We will take all of it, and we will buy it from you, and we can switch off like that. If you need us to turn off, we can turn off straight away, and we can turn back on instantly. We're not like, so I'm pretty sure with the gas plants, there's like a process of winding down. We can be on and off at a click, and we will buy all your excess energy from you. So it's actually Bitcoin mining can actually solve climate issues.
I mean, if you then will pay a small amount for that could change that could help the economics of it. And I mean, you guys should be very in favor of renewable energy then, because to get to a 70% renewable grid, there are going to be days when in Texas, there'll be 40 gigawatts of extra power. I mean, that would be on really windy, really sunny days. And there'll be days when there's none. When the wind and the solar are maxed out and you're cranking on your nuclear and your geothermal, your dispatchable power. But the goal would be to run as much wind and solar as possible, and you have to overbuild it to get a reliable grid.
And you are a fan of nuclear?
I would not describe myself as a fan. Okay. I understand that a lot of people don't like nuclear. I understand that there are the obvious disadvantages of it. That said, I would rather have nuclear than climate change. So if you came to me and you said, I will support policy on climate change if you support nuclear, it's like, start doing it. And I have hope for things like small modular reactors. There are ways to potentially solve problems of proliferation, problems with waste, problems with safety. So, I am completely open to that. I'm also open to geothermal. I'm open to carbon capture. I mean, I think I am in favor of letting the market decide what kind of dispatchable power. But importantly, you have to have the government come in and determine the mix of variable and dispatchable power. So right now in Texas, just to give you an idea, anybody can hook anything up to the grid with some limitations. And because wind and solar are the cheapest power, and we should talk about that because I want to make sure your viewers see some data on that. So they don't, because wind and solar are cheapest, that's the only that's the majority of power being hooked up. And if you let the market decide, it's going to be 100% wind and solar, and then you're going to have blackouts. So the government has to step in and say, we're going to subsidize this more expensive nuclear power because it provides value to the grid that isn't reflected in the purchase price or in the dollars per kilowatt hour. So this is a place of agreement I have with a lot of the renewable skeptics that you do have to treat them differently.
Okay. Do you have a chart on the cost per?
Sure. Can you show 29? So the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is the retail price in cents per kilowatt hour. And the y-axis is what fraction of joules of energy are generated from wind and solar. And these are by state in the United States. So you have to understand what the state symbols are. But IA is Iowa. They have among the cheapest power, and they get more than half of their power from wind and solar, mainly wind. South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, I'm reading down, New Mexico, North Dakota, Colorado.
What's HI?
It's Hawaii. Oh, okay. So they generate power with oil.
Okay. That is
a unique problem they have. They could be getting a lot of solar. I don't know why they don't have more solar in Hawaii, but so you can see that there's no correlation here between the price of power and the fraction of renewable energy. So people often will say, well, renewables make energy expensive, and they don't do that. Let me show you another.
What about reliability?
Go to the next slide.
I'm going to say, have any of these other states have any reliability issues?
So this is basically the same plot. And I should say, I made the previous one. I did not make this one, but I think it's correct because I was able to reproduce a bunch of the other plots you made. I just didn't make this one. It shows on the x-axis the duration of hours of interruption. And this is 2020, not 2021, because in 2021, Texas would be off the chart. Yeah. You wouldn't even be able to see the other states. This is how many power outages they have. And the y-axis is the percentage of wind and solar. And again, there's really no correlation here. It turns out that most power outages are not caused by generators, they're caused by transmission. A tree hits a power line, or Texas, you have an ice storm. That actually was related. Actually, Texas is bad. That was related to generators. But in most other cases, power outages are not related to generators. They're related to the transmission. So this shows that in practice, there's no increase in price with increase in penetration. But let me just show you one more.
That's increase in price to consumer?
Yeah, this is the retail price.
Okay, how much of this is subsidized?
Well, that's a great question. So let's go to slide 16. It's either 16 or 17. I'll be able to tell. Yep. All right, so this is a quantity called the levelized cost of energy. So essentially, it's the present value of the cost you're going to have to pay per kilowatt hour, per megawatt hour of power you generate. So it's how much it costs for you. So like a wind turbine, you build a wind turbine, it's going to cost you over 30 years. The present value of that is $30 per megawatt hour. And so there are two. So you bring up a good point, which is when you say that the price is low, it's always like, well, because it's subsidized. And so the number one response is the subsidies are tiny. So if you look at this shows in the dark lines the unsubsidized cost, and in the light lines the subsidized cost. And you can see they're not very different. They're a few dollars, maybe 10 or.
It's about 10% across most.
Yeah, maybe it's 10%. I would put it more like $10, $10 to $20 per megawatt hour.
Okay.
And so it's not a big effect. This is not what's driving it. And importantly, this is super important, fossil fuels are subsidized out the wazoo. There are tax, at least in the US, there are tax breaks for drillers. They don't pay for these external costs. They don't pay for climate change. They don't pay for air pollution. These are all subsidies that they're getting, and those are enormous. And so these are actually, so the subsidies actually have a very small effect. And go to the previous slide. And this actually compares all the different kinds of energy. So this is unsubsidized. So there's no subsidies on this. And it shows you the top one is, well, top one's rooftop PV. No one looks at. But if you look at the utility scale, so the vertical axis, for everyone to see, the vertical is the different energy sources, and the x-axis, the horizontal, is the price. And if you compare solar PV and wind, they're cheaper than all the fossil fuels. And you know, this is you know, we've reached the point. And then if you throw on the subsidies, the price of renewable energy gets cheaper and the price of fossil fuels gets more expensive. You know, I mean, or actually I take that back. If you throw on the subsidies, it's not going to affect the renewable energy very much, but the fossil fuel energy gets much more expensive. It's heavily subsidized through these external costs and through tax breaks and things like that.